After putting up with driving big cars during oil price and gasoline price spikes, consumers were looking for more fuel-efficient vehicles by the time the early 1980s rolled around. And to some degree, this was also mandated by the federal government because the U.S. had imposed corporate average fuel economy standards, or CAFE standards, that mandated that the fleet average across all vehicles sold by automakers had to be equivalent or greater to 27.5 miles per gallon by the mid-1980s. As a result, cars were significantly downsized, as were engines, weight was taken out, and you have a number of vehicles that were introduced across the domestic auto industry that were much smaller and lighter than their predecessors. Now, aside from the downsizing of vehicles, another strategy that was employed by automakers to achieve fuel economy standards was putting different types of engines in cars. I already mentioned that gasoline engines were significantly downsized along with the cars, but diesel power became something that was generally more attractive than it ever had been during this time frame. And that's because diesels tended to get better fuel economy than gasoline engines. They were more efficient. And the other good news for the consumer was back at this point in time, the diesel fuel prices were actually less than gasoline prices as well. So you not only got better fuel economy, you also were paying less per gallon when you filled up your tank at the fuel station. So diesel power was something that was coming into vogue, and General Motors decided that it wanted to capitalize on this diesel power in 1978 by introducing Oldsmobile's 350 cubic inch 5.7 liter V8 diesel in that particular year. It was a good thought, but American consumers really soured on the Oldsmobile diesel after just a few years in service. And that's because it suffered from so many different issues. First of all, remember that Americans weren't used to the, let's say, differences in driving that you had to adapt to with a diesel. If you were in cold weather climates, those first early 1978 diesels, you had to have the glow plugs warm up the engine for over a minute before you could start the engine. You can imagine just sitting in your cold car for over a minute on a cold day. Well, that's not going to be a great recipe for delighting customers. Thankfully, that was solved about a model year later with fast start glow plugs that reduced that wait time down to 6 or 7 seconds at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. But still, the other issues associated with diesels, the American public really just couldn't get over. One was the general noise that they emitted, significantly more than gasoline engines. Second was the smell and the odor. And then third was just the overall sluggishness. Remember, this Oldsmobile diesel was not turbocharged. It was just a regular old V8 diesel. It made around 120 horsepower, and it was often outfitted in cars that weighed 4,000 pounds or more. So it certainly endowed them with very sluggish acceleration. Think 0 to 60 times in the 16 to 20 second range. Very, very slow. In fact, my first car was a 1979 Cadillac Seville diesel. And that car, I loved it. It did get great fuel economy. I used to average, I think, about 27 miles per gallon, which was excellent. But it was so slow. So slow. It's one of those cars where if you're on a 2-lane road, you have to drop back and then floor it and gain some momentum before you try to pass the vehicle. It really taught you how to be a good driver because you had to anticipate those types of moves. In any case, by the early 1980s, Oldsmobile diesels had started to proliferate a little bit, despite the fact that consumers were really starting to sour on them. And Oldsmobile had introduced in 1979 a 1-year-only 4.3-liter V8 diesel. But in 1982, it decided to introduce the first V6 diesel that was ever placed in passenger cars. And that is the 4.3-liter V6 diesel, which Oldsmobile introduced in two forms, the LT6, which was outfitted in rear-wheel drive applications like the A-body vehicles, the Buick Regals, Oldsmobile Cutlasses for the day. And then there was the front-wheel drive vehicles that also had the Oldsmobile V6 diesel, and that was principally the A-body cars, the Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra as an example, or the Buick Century. Those were the vehicles which you more often than not found the 4.3-liter V6 diesel under the hood in. And it would spread to other cars, including in 1985, the C-body cars for that year only. And in 1985, that was the last year for the entire Oldsmobile diesel program, V6, V8. GM shut it down. But this V6 diesel is really interesting. I mentioned that it was the first passenger car diesel. There were other V6 diesels that had been produced by this point. Of course, Detroit Diesel had made a number of V6 diesels, most popularly the 6V71. And GMC even had a little-known V6 diesel that was based off of, I shouldn't say it was based off of, at least ran down the same tooling as its V6 engine lineup in the 1960s, and that was the Toro Flow diesel that continued to be produced into the 1970s. But for passenger cars, there really was never a V6 diesel before this Oldsmobile introduced engine. And it was, I would say, in general, quite interesting. Perhaps most strange was the fact that the rear-wheel drive V6 diesel had a number of different components from the front-wheel drive V6 diesel. The front-wheel drive variant had an aluminum head and an aluminum intake, a serpentine belt setup, a little bit different block. So it was quite a different variant, the front-wheel drive variant from the rear-wheel drive variant. And I would just say that while this engine was, well, it had some merits to it. The first Oldsmobile V8 diesel really just suffered from a number of issues, everything from injection pump failures to principally head gasket failures, because Oldsmobile wanted to make sure that they employed the same tooling in the V8 diesel as the V8 gas engine. So it had the same number of cylinder bolts per head, and with a 22.5 to 1 compression ratio versus an 8 to 1 compression ratio in the gasoline engines of the time, well, that just was not going to work, unfortunately, and these engines did end up blowing quite a few head gaskets. That was really their Achilles heel. The V6 diesel, though, was kind of designed from the ground up to be a diesel. Oldsmobile had not made a V6 gasoline engine, and consequently, it had some merit. Now, remember, this was a 90-degree V6, so it was off balance. Oldsmobile did take some pains, similar to the Buick 3.8-liter V6, which is also a 90-degree V6, to make this engine a bit smoother, but it was a diesel that kind of had some inherent challenges from the start. Though it was more reliable and had a better reputation than the 5.7-liter 350 cubic inch diesel. In production form, the engine made 85 horsepower, and it's not really all that great, and it was not a torque monster either. It made about 165 pound-feet of torque, so really not all that much. It had similar horsepower to the Iron Duke four-cylinder engine in the A-body cars, which is about 90 horsepower. It had a little bit more torque. And these cars, I would say the A-bodies outfitted with this engine, probably took about 15 seconds to go 0 to 60. So I would say definitely slow by today's standards. By the standards of the time, still slow, but not absolutely horrible, let's say. Regardless, one of the interesting things was that Oldsmobile was trying to come up with some different performance variants of its V6 diesel before the end of the run in 1985, I guess hoping to revive their diesel program. Now, the other interesting thing is that the typical way to do this with diesels would be to turbocharge them or have some sort of forced air induction. But for cost reasons, Oldsmobile, of course, was trying to figure out different ways that it could achieve that result without the expense of a turbocharger. And so what did it come up with? It came up with this awesome and weird engine, this tuned port induction diesel. You'll notice it says TID in this picture. This is an experimental engine produced around 1983 at the Ransom E. Olds Museum in Lansing, Michigan. And it's kind of humorous because you're putting tuned port induction on the diesel, which you can obviously see. It also has tuned headers, so not the standard cast iron headers. You got relatively expensive, not as expensive as a turbocharger, performance modifications. And the placard that's next to the engine denotes that this particular variant has not 85 horsepower like it would have in stock form, but instead it has a far greater, are you ready for it, 90 horsepower. So all of that, the headers, the tuned port induction, all of that for 5 additional horsepower. I guess it at least looks cool. And Oldsmobile never put this tuned port induction V6 diesel in any application. Like I said, this engine was produced as an experimental engine in 1983. The whole program would be shut down just a few years later. And I have a feeling that Oldsmobile knew that the end was nigh in this case, shall we say. Their diesel sales were precipitously declining, in part because of the reliability issues that now consumers really knew about, and that reputation was spreading, but also because fuel prices were dropping, and consumers cared less about fuel economy than they did before. They wanted big vehicles, and they wanted big gasoline engines that were powerful. They didn't want something that was super fuel efficient. And so the writing was kind of on the wall that the diesel was going to be sunset. But I do find it humorous that Oldsmobile came up with this tune-port induction V6 diesel for all of 5 additional horsepower. This also comes on the heels, by the way, of Oldsmobile trying a different variant of the diesel, which we've discussed in a previous video. But if you haven't seen it, check out my channel. Oldsmobile actually engineered an experimental V5 diesel. Yes, a 5-cylinder V5, and that sounds strange. By the way, there are other automakers who have produced V5 engines, most notably Volkswagen, but this V5 diesel, I think, is the only V5 diesel I've ever seen or heard of. Again, an experimental engine, and in that missing 5th cylinder, Oldsmobile kind of packaged the accessories. The idea was that this could go in smaller vehicles like the X cars, the Chevrolet Citation, Pontiac Phoenix, Buick Skylark, and the Oldsmobile Omega, but obviously this one never made it either. So what do you think of these crazy ideas in the Oldsmobile tune-port induction 4.3-liter V6 diesel? Was this just a silly idea, or was it an awesome idea? I have to imagine that nobody thinks it was the latter, but maybe somebody does out there. There are Oldsmobile diesel fan clubs. I don't know why, but you know what? Everybody's got their thing that they like, and that's what makes the hobby cool. Put a comment in the comment section and let me know your thoughts. Thanks again for watching.